kind of stressing. Like, I really want to just get it done, but I was starting to think maybe I'm out of my depth. See how that goes. Hello everyone! So today I'm going to be taking you through my watercolour painting process. This is of course similar to my processes for other paints, but generally not drawing. I've just shown you some of my equipment, but my absolute favourite equipment is of course my watercolour paper. And today I'm going to be using my Arches cold pressed watercolour paper. I adore Arches, the attention to detail is brilliant and it's a really nice paper to work with, especially with watercolour. But my board is massive, so I tend to chop it up a bit just to make it a little bit more practical to use. Now the inspiration for today's painting is actually from an art challenge by Bobby Chu and Irish Compete. The idea is that you have to draw or create your own fairy exchangeling in traditional mediums. A fairy exchangeling is a fairy who will take something from you and exchange it with something that the fairy considers to be of equal value. Now, I knew that I wanted my fairy exchangeling to be garden related, and I also wanted them to be old. So the first thing I did in my process was actually just to do a couple of sketches that would help me come up with some ideas for the character. So I've done a couple of sketches and I think it's getting quite late in the day now, and I think basically I've just tried to make it too complicated. So I've been kind of stressing. Like, I really want to just get it done, but I was starting to think maybe I'm out of my depth. The whole reason I was doing sketches was to try and familiarise myself with like certain shapes that I wanted to use and certain things that I wanted to use. So I was trying to prepare myself so that I wouldn't have this problem, and yet here we are, and it's the same sort of thing, which is faces. I think most people tend to just draw young female faces, and I don't want to just do that, and so I have been doing more older faces recently, but it's still different between doing something like that and then making up a completely imaginary face and it looking good. But I have been looking at a couple of other artists, and I think what it has demonstrated to me is that I'm just making it too complicated. So I've got another half hour and I'm just going to try and simplify it. See how that goes. I have to admit, I actually came really close to giving up at that point. I was really disheartened by my progress, and I decided that I would just try and sketch some characters, and if I felt comfortable, then I'd carry on. And I'm really glad I persisted because I actually really enjoyed this part of the process. So I decided that I was going to use some of the sketches that I had drawn earlier in the day to help me form the shapes of the characters I was going to draw. I really wanted them to have, one of them to have sort of a head that was shaped a bit like a flower bulb. So a couple of them have nice round heads. But it was interesting how I didn't intentionally go to create any particular characters. I just tweaked their physical attributes and they kind of morphed into different things, which I actually adored. When I'd finished, I actually just took a couple of my favorite physical characteristics from each of them and I morphed them together to create my favorite and final design. So I did a selection of faces because I didn't really know where to start with my drawing, because creating creatures from nothing is quite difficult. And if you look here, that was my first sketch. And this was quite disheartening because, I mean, yeah, I still kind of want to keep this idea, but so I feel a bit better after having done some like more expression-based characters. They're a lot more clear. What I seem to have created is some kind of little, I don't know, plant council. I mean, he looks like the one who is always telling the jokes. And he looks like the one who's definitely not amused by them. This guy looks like he'd be... I'm getting strong farmer vibes off this one. And, I mean, he is just so sweet. He looks like he'd want to be your wise mentor. / I'm getting a little bit of priest vibes off him. But that might be to do with this fabric, which I definitely want to keep. So I think I just want to take my favourite features from each, and I think I'm going to go more with one a bit like this, just for the purpose of this. I do really like this one, but I think for the purpose of this, I'd like to try more with this one. I was so happy when I had created my final sketch because I finally felt like I could do the part that I'm most confident at. I could finally start painting, and that was very reassuring for me. The reason that I wanted to create so many sketches before I put it on watercolor paper is because I think preparation is the most important part or it should be, in your process before painting. If you already have an idea of what you're going to do, if you're using a reference, it's perhaps not quite so important, assuming that you're good at drawing and you have good drawing skills. But if not, definitely grab a sketchbook and work out your image. In terms of this character was completely made from my imagination, so I felt like it was really important that I rough out the sketch beforehand, especially because watercolor paper is very delicate. So I didn't want to be applying it already to my paper and using my eraser and then run the risk of damaging my paper. I was actually really happy with my final sketch. It had all the main things that I'd tried to achieve. I'd created a character that was older, it was gardening themed. So overall, at this point, I was very happy. The first part of my process when painting is I wanted to do an outline of the watercolor along my sketch. And the reason that I wanted to do this was simply just to create more definition. You don't have to if you're creating a very loose image. You don't have to do this at all. I personally wanted to create a very defined image because it was a character, and I felt like those kind of things really make characters' features stand out. The next step of my process was simply to fill in the blocks with the midtones of the colours that I was going to use before I do the shadows and before I do the highlights. And if necessary, I'd also use the wet on wet technique to create very soft shading before I put in those more harsh shadows. The idea behind my fairy exchangeling was that this fairy goes to gardeners who particularly grow vegetables and fruit. There has to be some kind of food available for it. It could be the birdseed, maybe in your feeders, but more likely if you're growing strawberries or tomatoes or carrots, then this fairy is probably in your garden. Because the idea was that he's going to take some of your fruit and he's going to take some of your vegetables and he's going to exchange them with seeds. Not necessarily flower bulbs, but wild seeds. And I found this idea quite amusing because wild flowers are very important for gardens because they help attract insects and insects help attract birds. But obviously a lot of gardeners consider some wildflowers to be weeds. So I felt a little bit sorry for this fairy and that probably the majority of his gifts or exchanges probably were thrown in the compost once the gardener had found them. But this fairy is also inclined to pick up little things that he finds around your garden, whether that's bottle caps or jewelry. I remember one time we were picking strawberries in my granddad's fruit farm and my mum lost her mobile phone. So mum, I don't think you lost it anymore. Obviously, I think a fairy took it from you. So somewhere in that field there is a fairy running around with a Nokia. I think it was a Nokia. And if it is, it's probably still got 50% battery. The fairy's probably making loads of calls on that. Now I've applied the midtones, I'm going back in with the shadows. So this is sort of like the second to last part of my process, is applying all of the shadows. And obviously the reason that I do this is just to create depth so that my character doesn't look really flat on the paper. Now I've applied my shadows, I'm finally going to apply my favourite part, the highlights. So I'm just going to be using a little bit of white gouache. You can also use white gel pens or white Posca pens. I just happen to have the paint nearby to hand, so I use that one instead. But doing the highlights is perfect because it really makes things pop and stand out. And that is the last part of my watercolour painting process. My next video, I'm going to be doing some watercolour portraits. So if you're interested in watercolour still, it's going to be a tutorial and I'm going to be talking more about actual watercolour techniques like the wet on wet technique or the wet on dry technique. So perhaps if you're more of a beginner, feel free to come along to that one. And if you're interested, do remember to subscribe and click the notification button down below so that you'll get a notification when I upload the video. Thank you so much for joining me on this video. I really hope that you like my fairy. I'm actually really happy with him. He's my new little chum and I'm gonna have to find a place for him to live in my studio. Thank you so much again for joining me, everyone. I hope to see you next week on my next video. Bye for now.